writers, we should write ghost stories. Why don't we all write a ghost story? And everyone says, yeah, that's a great idea. And supposedly, at varying moments, everyone begins. So Claire Clairmont starts writing. We don't have any record of what she wrote. There's one tiny mention in one of Mary's journals that Claire was working on something. So we know that at least Claire started writing something, but there's no record of it going anywhere or being finished or anything else. Then, Polidori. So John Polidori. John Polidori is, at this point, I think he's maybe 22 years old at the most. At 21, he was the youngest graduate from the Edinburgh Medical School. So he's a doctor at 21. He's Doogie Howser. And not only is he a doctor at 21, he also fancies himself a poet and a writer, and he actually cares way more about being a writer than he does about being a doctor. Somehow he manages to meet Byron, and he gets involved with Byron, and Byron hires him as his personal physician. Byron likes the idea of traveling with a personal physician. So they start off on this tour of Europe together, and Polidori is there with the coterie, with this group at Villa Diodati. So Polidori starts to write too. Polidori winds up writing The Vampire, the very first vampire book in English. But it's much, much more than that. It's the first time that a vampire has ever been sexy. Up to this time, vampires have always been Nosferatu. They've always been hunchbacked, bald, misshapen heads, giant teeth, long fingers with huge nails. They've always been these creatures that lived in the dark. And suddenly, Polidori turns that all on its head. And the vampire in his novel is young, he's handsome, he's a seducer, and he's an aristocrat. So, what does he do? As a vampire, he makes friends with people, and then he lives off their blood, and then discards them. Well, that's what's going on at the time of the writing for Polidori and Byron. Byron has already tired of Polidori. And they openly, while they're hanging out together at the villa, everyone is except Mary. Mary calls him poor Polidori. And she does this a number of times in letters and in her journal. But the other people are openly mean to him and cruel to him, and will call him names and deliver little digs and slights, and he's really getting sick of it. And Byron especially is kind of letting him know their time together is coming to an end. So when he writes this book, he creates an aristocratic figure who's young and who's a seducer, who uses up his friends and then casts them aside. Yeah. It's pretty much recognized that the vampire in that book is actually Byron. It's Polidori getting his own back at Byron. It's a fantastic book. It's a great book. If nothing else, it creates the idea of the aristocratic, young, sexy vampire that then, passes down all the way to us now. I think that in and of itself is pretty huge. Stoker was able to build on that to create his whole character, and we've never looked back. So Polidori, another one of that group. Byron in that book, I believe, is Mazeppa. Towards the back of Mazeppa by Byron, there are some fragments. And that's all Byron does. Byron writes something that's kind of a whole story, and sometimes, people say it's not a whole story, no, this is it. Yeah, there it is, a fragment. And it's an interesting story. It also has someone in it who may or may not be a vampire, may or may not be a ghost. It's okay. It's all right. Then there's also the thing that Shelley did. And Shelley wrote some stories that are just called ghost stories. And there's a few of them. And he even says something like they're in the style of so-and-so. And, those are pretty good too. They're really short. But, they're not that scary. They're not that interesting. And it's only Mary. It's only, Mary Shelley who decides, I am going to write something spectacular, something no one has ever seen before. And Mary just starts in. And of course, like I always say, it's really important to remember who Mary is. She's a teenager. She has a child to take care of. By now, she's helping to run the domestic staff of the villa. She is writing a proof copy of that book, Shelley's The Revolt of Islam. She's writing a proof copy of that for publication. I think somewhere on the table, and if it's not, I can certainly get it. I think it might be that one, is the third cantos of Byron's Childe Harold. Yeah, that's that one. So she's also writing, he had been working on that before the Shelleys got there. And he keeps working on it, and he finishes it. And, he just naturally, they all trust Mary implicitly and have a high regard for her literary ability. So he just immediately says to Mary, yeah, can you, work on this and send it off to my publisher too? And Mary says, oh, certainly. So Mary's working on that whole book. I mean, look at how big that book is. And she's working on the whole third cantos. And she's writing a proof copy of that book. And she starts writing Frankenstein. She's also editing their travel writing. I mean, it's impossible to even think about, and then she's keeping up an enormous correspondence. So over the period of a year or so, she writes this novel, and, Percy works on it with her, and they go back and forth, and they look at different parts of it, and, Mary's really pretty strong. And a lot of times Percy says, I think you should write this, or I think you should put this in. We see it in the manuscript, and we don't see it in the finished copy, because Mary doesn't take all of his ideas. She doesn't accept all of his ideas, at least not yet. So that 1818 version, actually late 1817, that late 1817 version that they send off and that they try to get published is all Mary Shelley. As much Mary Shelley as any book written by anybody. Controversy has raged at different times in different decades over who actually wrote Frankenstein, how much did Percy write. There's been so much really, really strong scholarship done, and that's what you find in that Robinson notebooks. It's the hard study of the original manuscript and looking at Mary's hand and looking at how Mary crosses things out and writes other things in, and then being able to look at that 1818 edition. And you see the things in the manuscript that Percy's crossed out or that Percy's notated, and then you see his notes in his own hand. And you can tell their hands apart really easily. So when the scholarship is done using primary source materials, things start to change. So Mary gets done, and they start to send the book off. The first place they send it is to Olyers. Olyers is Shelley's publisher. So, Shelley naturally feels like, well, he's publishing all of my poems. He might as well publish this too.